He let the small wolf Admiral warm up in his tent. Then she locked the door. The wind howled outside the tent, its icy fingers tugging at the fabric, sending gusts of snow swirling through the desolate landscape. Captain Elias Brooks sat at the center of his command tent, studying a holographic map of the surrounding terrain. The constant cold made it hard to focus, but the war didn't wait for the weather to improve. Elias had grown used to the harsh conditions of the icy planet. He had led his crew through endless battles, and despite the constant strain, he never allowed himself to show weakness. His crew depended on him for guidance, and in turn, he relied on their strength to survive. It had been weeks since they had last made contact with their fleet, and the isolation was starting to take its toll. The planet was desolate, no allies, no resources, and the constant pressure of fighting off enemy raids kept them all on edge. But Elias had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let anything, not even the brutal cold, stop him from doing it. A soft knock on the tent flap broke his concentration. "Come in," Elias called without looking up. The flap opened, and a shadowed figure stepped into the dimly lit tent. Elias blinked, taken aback for a moment. Standing in front of him was a small, wolf-like alien, Admiral Korith. Her fur was matted with snow, her pale blue eyes narrowed with both exhaustion and intensity. She was no ordinary visitor. She was a leader in her faction, feared across the galaxy for her brutal efficiency. The Wolf Admiral's reputation was built on cold logic and merciless decisions, and her people had become a force to be reckoned with. Elias had heard of her, of course. Who hadn't? But never in his wildest dreams did he imagine he would meet her like this, alone, standing in the cold, seeking shelter. "I need warmth." Korith's voice was low but clear, her gaze unwavering. Elias studied her for a moment, his instincts telling him to be cautious. He had been warned about the wolf-like species, about how their cold exterior masked a fierce warrior mentality, but this was no battlefield. This was his tent, and he had to make a decision. "Come in," he said, motioning toward the small space near the fire. "You've been caught in the storm." Korith didn't need to be told twice. She moved quickly, shedding layers of frost-covered armor as she approached the warmth of the fire. She was small compared to some of the other warriors he had met, but her presence filled the room, her intense gaze never leaving him. "I didn't expect to find a human here," she said, settling into a chair. Her voice held a hint of curiosity, but there was something more, something deeper beneath the surface. Elias shrugged. "I didn't expect to find an admiral stranded in a snowstorm, but I'm not one to turn away someone in need of shelter." Korith glanced at him, her eyes scanning the tent as if trying to gauge whether this was some kind of trap. But Elias had no hidden agenda. The storm outside was brutal, and he had no intention of letting anyone freeze to death on his watch, no matter who they were. "You don't trust me," she said, as though reading his mind. "I understand." Elias didn't deny it. Trust was earned, and he wasn't foolish enough to blindly trust a leader of an enemy faction, even if she was currently seeking shelter. But he had no reason to assume she was a threat right now. She was a survivor just like him. "I don't trust anyone, Admiral," he said. "Not until I've spent time with them, but right now you need warmth, and I've got plenty of that." The two of them fell into an uneasy silence as Korith took a seat, her eyes never leaving Elias. The fire crackled between them, but the air still felt thick with tension. She didn't speak again for several minutes, only staring into the flames, her mind clearly somewhere else. Elias noticed the subtle shift in her posture, a slight relaxation as the warmth seeped into her bones. "You don't look like the typical warrior," Elias said, trying to break the silence. "I expected someone bigger." Korith's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile, but it was hard to tell. "And you expected me to be cold? I am cold, but not all the time." Elias raised an eyebrow, unsure of how to respond to that. He had never met an alien like Korith. Her eyes were filled with a strange mix of authority and vulnerability. The way she spoke, even in her quiet moments, commanded respect. She wasn't just a fighter, she was a leader. "You've heard of me," she said, her tone shifting slightly. "I'm sure of it, the Wolf Admiral." Merciless, cold, a killer. Elias met her gaze, unwavering. "I've heard the rumors, yes, but rumors don't tell the whole story. People are more than their reputations." Korith didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her eyes back to the fire, lost in thought. Elias couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. Did she ever feel the weight of the decisions she had made, the lives lost under her command? It wasn't something he could ask outright, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than the warrior who had earned her place in the history books. Minutes passed, and the silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Korith seemed to be gathering her thoughts, her eyes flickering toward Elias as if deciding whether or not to speak again. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter now, almost introspective. "You think I'm a monster?" Elias was taken aback by the question. "No. I think you're a leader, a survivor." Korith didn't look at him, she didn't need to. Her expression, hidden beneath the rough exterior, told him everything. "A monster nonetheless." Elias shook his head. "If you were a monster, you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't have asked for shelter, you would have kept fighting no matter the cost, but you're not a monster, you're a person." For the first time, Korith's gaze softened. It was a brief moment, but Elias saw it. She wasn't just a cold, calculating admiral. She was someone who had been shaped by the brutal demands of war, just like him, perhaps even more so. She leaned back in her chair, her fur still damp from the snow, her eyes flickering with an emotion Elias couldn't quite place. "Maybe, but I'm not sure I can be both." "You can," Elias replied simply. "You just have to decide which side of you want to show." Korith's eyes narrowed slightly. "And which side would that be?" "The one that wants to survive," Elias said. "The one that wants to change the galaxy for the better." There was a pause before Korith responded. "I don't know if that's possible, but I'll consider it." Elias couldn't help but smile, even if just a little. He wasn't sure if they could ever truly be allies, but in this moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to Admiral Korith than anyone had ever known. The fire crackled in the silence as Elias and Korith sat, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the storm raged on, but for the time being they were safe, together for a moment. The fire crackled softly in the center of the tent, casting a warm, flickering glow on the faces of Elias and Korith. For a moment the world outside seemed far away, shut out by the thick walls of fabric that surrounded them. The wind howled relentlessly, its icy breath tugging at the edges of the tent, but the warmth inside was a welcome contrast. Korith had barely spoken since their exchange earlier. She sat in the chair across from Elias, her eyes now fixed on the fire. The glow highlighted the sharp angles of her face, the faint hints of battle scars visible on her skin. Despite her calm exterior, Elias could sense the tension in the air. It was in the way her muscles remained taut, in the way her sharp eyes never seemed to relax. She was a leader, a warrior, and even in this quiet moment, that side of her was undeniable. Elias watched her closely, his thoughts drifting as he examined the unexpected situation. He had seen many battles in his career, but he had never imagined himself sharing a fire with an alien commander, much less one with a reputation as fearsome as Korith's. He wondered how much of the stories were true, how much of the cruelty attributed to her was exaggerated. People in his world often painted their enemies as monsters, but he had learned not to believe everything he heard. "You don't talk much," Elias said, breaking the silence. "Most leaders I've met have plenty to say. They don't usually sit in silence with their enemies." Korith's gaze shifted toward him, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "Leaders don't always need to talk," she replied. "Sometimes silence is the loudest statement you can make." Elias chuckled softly. "Fair enough. I suppose silence can be powerful in its own way." They both fell silent again, but this time the quiet was heavier, more charged. The tension between them was like a thin thread stretched taut, each aware of the other's presence, but unsure of how to proceed. Elias didn't want to push her, but the longer they sat in silence, the more the awkwardness of the moment gnawed at him. "You're not like the others," Korith spoke again, her voice quieter this time, almost introspective. "Most humans I've encountered are either terrified or eager to fight. You're neither. You sit there calm and composed, as if you don't even care that I'm sitting here in your tent." Elias leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "I'm not terrified of you," he said after a pause. "I respect you, Korith, but I'm not afraid." "Respect," she tilted her head slightly. "You're a brave man, then." "I've learned that fear doesn't help much in the middle of a war," Elias answered. "It just clouds your judgment. I'd rather respect my enemies than fear them. It makes it easier to understand them and maybe, just maybe, find a way to survive." Korith's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "You talk about survival like it's a simple thing," she said. "For some of us, it's not about surviving, it's about winning at any cost. And for you, Elias asked, his tone soft but inquisitive. What's your goal, Korith? Is it just to win, or is there something more? Her eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite read. She remained silent for a moment, and Elias wasn't sure if she was avoiding the question or simply gathering her thoughts. He waited, letting her take her time. Survival is the goal, she finally said. But it's not just survival for me, it's survival for my people. Everything I've done, every choice I've made has been for them. The war, the bloodshed, it's all necessary. We fight because if we don't, we die. If we don't win, we lose everything. Elias nodded slowly, his gaze steady. I get it, I do. I've led people too. I know what it's like to feel like every decision you make is life or death for those you lead. Korith didn't respond immediately, but Elias noticed her posture shift slightly. There was a subtle vulnerability in the way her shoulders relaxed, just a little. It was a small change, but to someone who had spent years in the field, it didn't go unnoticed. He wondered if she even realized she was letting her guard down, just a fraction. The tension between them was still palpable, but it had shifted. Instead of hostility or distrust, there was now a sense of mutual understanding. They were both soldiers, both leaders, both carrying the weight of their people's survival on their shoulders. That weight was a burden neither could escape, but it was one they shared, if only for a moment. You've lost people too, haven't you? Korith asked quietly, her eyes not meeting his. I can see it in the way you speak, the way you carry yourself. Elias felt a pang in his chest. He knew what she was referring to. The countless battles, the crew members who had fallen, the faces of those who would never return home. I've lost too many to count, he said quietly. And it never gets easier. Every time someone dies, it's like a piece of me goes with them. But I can't stop. I can't let their deaths be in vain. Korith nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. I understand that better than you think. I've lost more than I ever thought I could. And I've had to keep fighting, even when it felt like the world was falling apart around me. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was a shared space, a mutual understanding that neither needed to explain. They both carried their burdens. They both understood the weight of leadership. And for a brief moment, it was as though the war didn't matter. There was no enemy, no battle lines, no factions. There were just two people, sitting in the quiet warmth of a tent, letting the fire crackle and the cold wind rage outside. Finally, Korith broke the silence again. You've given me warmth when you had no reason to. You've shown me a kindness I didn't expect. Her voice was low, but there was something different in it now, a kind of respect, perhaps even gratitude. I don't know why you did it, but I won't forget it. Elias glanced over at her, his expression steady. Because I don't believe in fighting out of fear. I believe in doing what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it means offering shelter to someone who's technically my enemy. Korith was quiet for a moment, her eyes shifting toward the fire again. She didn't speak, but Elias could see the conflict in her. The idea of accepting kindness was foreign to her, and he could understand why. Leaders like her were trained not to show weakness, not to trust easily. They were warriors, not nurturers. Still, there was a subtle shift in her. The wolf-like warrior who had entered his tent, cold and fierce, was no longer the same one sitting across from him now. She was still a soldier, still a leader, but there was a crack in her armor, a small one. Enough for Elias to see through, to glimpse the person beneath the warrior. You're not like the others, she said again, her voice softer this time. You don't see me as a threat, or maybe you do, but you're willing to see past it. Elias smiled slightly. Everyone has a story. I don't judge people based on what I hear about them. I judge them by their actions, their words. And what do you see in me? Korith asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias leaned forward, his gaze steady. I see a leader who has fought for everything she believes in. A leader who carries the weight of her people on her shoulders. And I see someone who, just like me, is trying to find a way to survive in a world that doesn't make sense anymore. Korith didn't respond. She didn't need to. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and true. They were both survivors. They were both leaders. And maybe, just maybe, they both had more in common than they realized. As the fire continued to crackle and the storm outside raged on, Elias and Korith sat in silence, the quiet bond between them deepening. There was still much to be done. The war was far from over. But for now, in this moment, they had found something rare, understanding. The fire burned steadily, casting a warm light over the two figures in the tent. Outside, the storm continued to rage, its fury unrelenting against the walls of fabric. But inside the small, makeshift shelter, the atmosphere was different now. The tension that had once felt heavy and oppressive had loosened, and there was a fragile sense of calm between Captain Elias Brooks and Admiral Korath. For the first time since they had met, Elias felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from knowing the war was over. It wasn't that simple. No, this peace was born from the understanding that had begun to grow between them. They weren't just two enemies caught in an endless conflict anymore. In that moment, they were two leaders, two warriors who had seen the harshness of battle and had the scars to prove it. Korath had relaxed somewhat, her shoulders less tense than before, though her eyes still carried the weight of her position. Elias could tell she was still wary, still processing everything. Trust didn't come easily for someone like her. But then again, trust didn't come easily for him either. He had learned the hard way to never trust anyone blindly, but something about Korath's presence made him feel like she wasn't just another enemy. She was someone who understood what it meant to lead, to make impossible decisions every day. The silence between them stretched, but it was no longer uncomfortable. Elias could feel that Korath was thinking, her mind working through something, and he was content to let her take her time. He had learned long ago that some things couldn't be rushed. At last, Korath broke the silence. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "You don't know what it's like," she said, her gaze distant, as though she were talking more to herself than to him. "To be responsible for so many lives. To lead people into battle knowing you're sending them to die." Elias didn't say anything right away. He didn't need to. He had heard those words before, though not from someone like Korath. His own experiences as a leader were full of moments where he had sent people into battle, knowing full well that not all of them would make it back. He could see the toll it had taken on her. He had seen it in her eyes ever since they first spoke. "I do know," he said quietly. "I've been in your position. I've had to send men and women to die for a cause I couldn't always fully believe in. It never gets easier, but you keep doing it because you have to. Because it's your job." Korath looked at him then, her eyes sharp and searching. "You don't sound like the others," she remarked, her voice low but thoughtful. "Most humans I've met would have been eager to fight, but you don't seem to care for it, for the bloodshed." Elias shook his head, his gaze steady. "I fight because I have to, I don't enjoy it. And if I could end this war tomorrow, I would, but it's not that simple, is it?" "No," Korath replied, her voice almost a whisper. "It's never that simple." She was quiet for a moment, as though weighing something in her mind. Elias could see the struggle within her. She was a warrior, trained to lead and to fight, but beneath the armor, beneath the fierce exterior, there was something else. A part of her that yearned for peace, for something more than just survival. "Sometimes," Korath continued, her voice barely audible now, "I wonder if it's all worth it. All this killing, all this destruction. Is it worth it if we can't find a way to stop the cycle?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He had asked himself that question 1,000 times. The weight of war was something no one could truly understand until they had been in the thick of it, until they had seen the faces of the people they were supposed to protect torn apart by the violence of battle. "I don't know if it's worth it," he said finally. "But I do know that if we give up now, then everything we've fought for, the lives we've lost, will be for nothing. And I can't live with that. None of us can." Korath met his gaze again, and for the first time there was something different in her eyes. It wasn't the cold, calculating look of an admiral who had seen too much war. It was something softer, something more human. "I think I understand," she said slowly. "Maybe I've been too focused on the fight, on winning at any cost. I've forgotten what it means to live for something more than victory." Elias didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, his expression somber. He understood all too well what she meant. There had been times when he had become consumed by the war, lost in the endless cycle of battles, victories, and losses. It was easy to forget what it was all for. It was easy to get caught up in the fight and lose sight of everything else. The fire crackled in the silence, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Elias watched as Korath stared into the flames, her mind clearly elsewhere. She was still a warrior, still a leader, but in that moment she was also just a person. A person who had seen too much, who had been forced to make impossible choices, and who, deep down, was just trying to find a way to survive. As the silence stretched on, Elias felt the weight of the situation settle around him. The storm outside had started to subside, but the tension between him and Korath was still thick in the air. It wasn't the kind of tension that came from distrust or animosity. It was the tension of two people who had lived through things they didn't want to talk about, who had both been forced to make decisions that haunted them. It was the kind of tension that came from shared experience, and it was something neither of them could escape. "Are you ever afraid?" Korath asked suddenly, breaking the silence again. Elias looked up, surprised by the question. "Afraid?" he repeated. "Of what?" "Of dying," she said, her voice low. "Of losing everything, of failing." Elias paused. He hadn't expected that question. Most people, especially soldiers, didn't ask it. It was the kind of question people kept to themselves, buried deep inside. But Korath had asked it, and there was a vulnerability in her tone that he couldn't ignore. "I used to be," he admitted after a moment, "but not anymore. I've seen too much to fear death now. I just want to make sure that when it comes, I can say I did everything I could, that I didn't give up, that I kept fighting for something worth fighting for." Korath was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Maybe that's what we all need, something worth fighting for." Elias didn't answer. He simply looked at her, knowing that the conversation wasn't over, that there was still much to be said, much to be understood. But for now, the words between them were enough. They didn't need to say anything more. They were both tired of the war, tired of the constant battle, but they were also still standing. And in this moment, that was enough. The fire flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the tent. The storm outside had finally begun to die down, and the wind had slowed to a dull roar. It was almost as if the world outside was holding its breath, waiting for something. Elias looked at Korath one last time. "We don't have to fight this battle alone," he said softly. Korath looked at him, her eyes searching his face. For a moment there was a flicker of something like hope. But it was gone just as quickly as it had come, replaced by the familiar mask of the warrior she had always been. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but for now we fight." The hours passed slowly, the fire in the center of the tent burning lower with each passing minute. The storm outside had died down, but the stillness of the night seemed to stretch longer than usual. Elias sat in his chair, staring into the flames, lost in thought. Korath had remained mostly quiet since their conversation had shifted. She was no longer the cold, calculating leader he had once imagined. She was something more complex, something he couldn't quite understand. But there was something about her, something in the way she had opened up, even if just a little, that made Elias feel like there was still hope for both of them. As the night wore on, the cold seemed to creep back into the tent. Elias noticed Korath shivering slightly despite the warmth from the fire. He stood up and walked over to where she sat, her arms crossed in front of her for warmth. "You're cold," he said, his voice softer than usual. Korath looked up, her pale blue eyes meeting his. There was a flicker of something, surprise maybe, before she looked away quickly, as though trying to hide the vulnerability in her expression. "I'm fine," she said quietly. "The cold doesn't bother me." Elias raised an eyebrow. "It's clear it does, you're shivering." She didn't respond at first, but after a moment she let out a sigh, her breath visible in the cold air. "I'm not used to being helped," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I lead. I don't need others to take care of me." Elias understood that. He had met people like Korath before, those who carried the weight of their leadership like a heavy burden, never asking for help, never showing weakness. But there was something different about her. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a person, too. And Elias couldn't help but wonder how long she had been carrying this burden alone. "Nobody's asking you to rely on me," Elias said gently, "but you don't have to do everything alone." Korath didn't look at him. She stared at the fire, her face unreadable. But Elias could see the conflict in her. She was used to fighting, to leading her people through battle after battle, but she wasn't used to showing any vulnerability. She wasn't used to letting anyone in. He didn't know what had happened in her past. He didn't know what had shaped her into the person she had become. But he did know that people like Korath didn't just wake up one day and decide to be cold, to be distant. There was a story there, a story of pain, loss, and survival. And Elias wasn't sure if he was ready to hear it, but he knew he had to try. "Why do you do it?" he asked, his voice calm. "Why do you keep fighting? Why do you keep leading your people into war when it feels like there's no end in sight?" Korath's gaze flickered toward him, but she didn't speak. The question seemed to hang in the air between them, unanswered. She looked away again, her lips pressed together in a tight line. "You don't have to answer that," Elias said, sensing her hesitation. It's hard to understand, you know." I've been at the front lines, I've lost people, but I can't imagine carrying the weight of an entire faction, knowing that every decision you make could cost someone their life. Korith's eyes softened for a moment, but the hardness in her gaze quickly returned. You think I don't understand that? She said, her voice sharp. I know exactly what it feels like. Every day I wake up knowing that my choices have consequences. And every night I go to sleep wondering if I've done enough to keep my people safe. I don't. I don't get to be weak. I don't get to make mistakes. Elias was quiet, watching her carefully. He could see the weight in her shoulders, the tension in her posture. She was carrying something heavy, something she had never shared with anyone else. But he knew she wouldn't open up easily. She wasn't like him. He could talk about his struggles, about the people he had lost, but Korith had built walls around herself. And it was clear that she wasn't ready to let those walls down. You don't have to carry it all alone, Korith, Elias said quietly. I don't care if you're an admiral or if you're from a different faction. No one should have to bear the weight of the world by themselves. She met his gaze again, her expression unreadable. For a long moment they simply stared at each other as if weighing the truth of his words. Finally, she looked away again, her eyes distant. Maybe you're right, she murmured. But I don't know how to stop. How do you just let go of something like this? How do you stop being who you are when everything around you depends on it? Elias stepped closer, his tone gentle but firm. You don't have to stop being who you are, but you do need to let yourself rest. Let yourself be human again. Korith's lips twisted into something that might have been a smile, though it was bitter and tired. Human, she repeated softly. I don't know if I remember what that even feels like anymore. Elias knelt down beside her, his voice low and steady. You've been so focused on being a leader, on being the strong one, that you've forgotten how to be. Just you. But it's okay to be weak sometimes. It's okay to take a break. She didn't respond, but Elias could see the tension in her slowly beginning to ease. It was as though he had given her permission to feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time, vulnerability. After a long silence, Korith finally spoke again. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper. Do you ever wonder if it's all worth it? The fighting, the killing, all of it. Do you ever wonder if we're just chasing something that isn't even real? Elias thought about it for a moment. He had asked himself that same question more times than he could count. The war had become so long, so drawn out, that sometimes it felt like they were fighting for nothing. The cause seemed so distant, so lost. But they couldn't stop now, not when they were so close to the end. I think, Elias said slowly, that sometimes it feels like we're chasing something we'll never catch. But if we don't keep chasing, then we've lost everything. I can't let that happen. Korith nodded, her eyes distant again. She didn't say anything else, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was filled with understanding of the burden they both carried, the weight of leadership and war that neither of them could escape. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the tent as the night stretched on. Elias knew that the storm outside had passed, but the storm inside Korith was far from over. She was still a warrior, still a leader, but now there was a hint of something more, a glimpse of the person she could be when she allowed herself to rest, to feel. Elias stood up and stretched, his eyes catching Korith's once more. You don't have to stay here if you don't want to, he said. The storm's over. We can get back to work in the morning. She looked at him, her gaze thoughtful. You've been kind to me, Elias. More than anyone else would be. Her voice was quiet, but there was something genuine in it. Maybe I've been wrong about humans. Elias smiled slightly. Maybe, but you'll see we're not all bad. Korith didn't respond immediately, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something like hope. And for the first time in a long time, Elias felt like they were moving toward something better. Not just for them, but for everyone. And maybe, just maybe, that was all they needed to keep going. The first rays of light broke through the cracks in the tent, casting a soft glow over the space. The fire had long since died down, leaving only the remnants of ash in the small fireplace. Outside, the storm had finally stopped, and the world beyond the tent was still, quiet, and covered in a blanket of fresh snow. Elias had barely slept, his mind racing through the events of the night. The conversation with Korith had unsettled him in ways he hadn't expected. They were enemies, after all, leaders of opposing factions locked in a war that had no end in sight. But somehow, sitting in the stillness of the tent, it didn't feel like war anymore. It felt like two people, simply trying to survive, trying to make sense of a world that seemed to be falling apart. Korith had fallen asleep in the chair by the fire, her head tilted slightly to the side, her breathing slow and steady. For a moment, Elias just watched her, taking in the quiet vulnerability she had shown the night before. It was a side of her he had never expected to see. The fierce, unyielding leader had let her guard down just enough to show that beneath it all, there was something more, a person, not just a warrior. He stood up quietly, stretching his arms and legs to shake off the stiffness from the night. The cold outside the tent was biting, but inside it was warm enough. Korith stirred slightly in her sleep, but she didn't wake. Elias smiled to himself, then moved to the small table at the far end of the tent. He grabbed a cup of water and drank deeply, the cool liquid refreshing him. As he set the cup down, he noticed the small bundle of supplies they had, ration packs, a few blankets, and a couple of weapons. It was clear they didn't have much. But he had learned to make do with less over the years. He wasn't sure how long Korith had been stranded here, but he knew it couldn't have been easy for her. Even the hardest warriors needed rest, needed something to ground them when the world around them was spinning out of control. Korith's eyes fluttered open just as Elias was turning back toward her. For a moment, she looked confused, as if she didn't recognize where she was. But then her gaze focused on him and the fog of sleep cleared. She straightened up in her chair, brushing the sleep from her eyes. "You didn't have to let me stay," she said, her voice still thick with sleep but sharp as always. "I should have left last night." Elias shook his head. "You needed rest, you didn't leave because you couldn't, and I wasn't about to let you freeze outside." Korith didn't reply immediately, but the way she looked at him, an unreadable expression, neither angry nor grateful, made Elias feel as if there were more on her mind. Something deeper, something she wasn't saying. "I don't trust easily," she said finally, her tone quieter than usual. "You're the first person in a long time who hasn't seen me as a threat." "I don't see you as a threat," Elias replied, his voice steady. "I see you as a person, a leader, yes, but a person. And sometimes people need a little kindness, even if they're warriors." Korith didn't respond right away. She simply stood up, stretching her arms and legs as she shook off the stiffness from her own sleep. Elias noticed the weariness in her movements, the toll the war had taken on her both physically and mentally. "You're not what I expected," she said after a moment, her voice softer. "I thought all humans were the same, eager to fight, eager to win, but you're different." Elias glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe I'm not as eager to fight as some, but I've seen enough to know that winning isn't always everything. Sometimes it's about surviving, and sometimes it's about knowing when to step back, when to rest, when to ask for help." Korith turned toward him, her eyes searching his face. She had always been calculating, always measuring her next move, but now in the quiet of the tent with no battle to fight, she seemed human. And for the first time, Elias realized how much of a toll the war had taken on her. "You've learned that lesson the hard way," she said, a hint of recognition in her voice. "We both have." Elias nodded slowly. "We all have." They stood in silence for a few moments, the weight of their shared understanding hanging between them. There was still a war to fight, still a future to face, but in that moment neither of them felt the need to rush into it. There was peace in the quiet, a fragile peace, but one that felt genuine. Korith broke the silence first. "I'll be leaving soon," she said. "My people will be looking for me, and you have your own responsibilities." Elias didn't want her to leave, not just yet. There was something about the way they had connected in the hours before, something about the way they had shared their stories, their burdens, that made him wish they could stay in this small tent forever. But he knew the reality. They were leaders, both bound by duty, both carrying the weight of their people's survival. They couldn't afford to ignore that. "I know," Elias said quietly, "but I don't think either of us is in a rush to get back to the war." Korith's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "No, I suppose not." She picked up the small pack by her side, slinging it over her shoulder with practiced ease. Her movements were quick and precise, a soldier preparing for whatever came next. But there was a softness to her now, a gentleness that hadn't been there before. Elias stood in the doorway of the tent, watching her prepare to leave. He wasn't sure what to say, how to say goodbye to someone who had been both an enemy and an unexpected ally. But there was one thing he knew for sure. The war was far from over, but the path forward didn't have to be as lonely as it had been before. "Good luck out there," Elias said, his voice steady. Korith turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. "Good luck to you too, Elias." "Stay alive." "I plan to," Elias replied with a slight smile. And with that, Korath turned and walked out of the tent. Elias stood there for a moment, watching her disappear into the distance, her figure quickly swallowed by the vast, empty snowfield. He wasn't sure if they would meet again. The war would continue, as wars often did, and they were still on opposite sides. But for a brief moment, they had shared something more than just animosity. They had shared an understanding, a connection, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there could be moments of humanity. Elias took a deep breath, turning back into the tent. There was work to be done, battles to be fought, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't alone in this fight, not anymore. And with that thought, he grabbed his pack, strapped on his gear, and stepped outside into the cold, ready to face whatever came next.